Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you're back for this week's session of our study called Continue. And today we're going to be talking about Scripture. And you might be wondering, why haven't we been talking about Scripture before? Well, we've been talking about Scripture all the way through our study here, but today we want to talk about how Scripture helps us as we continue to follow Jesus. So we're going to look at two verses today. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 22, verse 29, and we're going to look at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Starting in Matthew chapter 22, verse 29, it says this: Jesus replied, "You are in error because you do not know the scriptures nor the power of God." Now, let's just stop there and look at the scripture first. The situation here is that Jesus is being asked a question. He's being asked a question that's really technical about the scriptures and the Old Testament, and people are trying to trip him up. Okay, they're trying to catch him in saying something that wouldn't be considered okay in his interpretation of the scripture. And of course, Jesus, being the Word, the God himself, he is the author of scripture. So to tell the author of a book that they don't know what they're talking about when they're speaking about their own book, that's kind of ridiculous, right? So they're trying to trip him up in these questions that they're asking about a specific situation. And the situation is less important right now to us than these words that he challenges them with. He challenges them by saying that they are in error. So if they can be in error, that means that there is a correct interpretation of what scriptures mean. Jesus is saying, you've got it wrong. And that is something that I want to avoid as I am learning to follow him better. I want to avoid getting it wrong. And so what he says next helps us understand how to get it right. He says, you are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. So knowing the scriptures is not just knowing what one verse says, but more understanding how it all fits together. Knowing the scriptures means understanding whole the whole of scripture. And from it, what are we supposed to learn? We're supposed to gather from knowing the whole of scripture. We're supposed to understand who God is. He says here, you're in error because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God. Meaning they don't understand the scripture, but that's not all. They don't understand who God is. And so from our study of scripture, we want to avoid error by learning the whole of scripture and also who God is. And to help us with that, let's look at our second passage. It says 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Timothy is the recipient of this letter from Paul, and Paul is telling him all scripture is God breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Now, thoroughly equipped is the way that I want to be as a servant of God. As I continue to follow Jesus, I want to have all that I need thoroughly equipped. And so, in order to be thoroughly equipped, Paul says that we need to understand all scripture and the individual parts. All scripture is useful for teaching and rebuking, correcting, and training, meaning we can use it for lots of different reasons. We can use it to learn initially. We can use it to change the way that we have been going or have been thinking, and we can use it to continue to learn and grow in our practice. And in our practice, not just in our knowledge of Scripture, because our knowledge might get greater and greater and greater, but unless we put into practice the things that we are learning, then that's not very useful. At the end of this passage in Second Timothy, it says that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. And so the intended outcome of learning Scripture, of being corrected and trained by Scripture, is that we would do all the good works that God has called us to do. And in this way, we avoid the errors that we might otherwise fall into. There might be errors of our own interpretation. There might be ways that we would read the Scripture that wouldn't be accurate. There might be ways that other people interpret Scripture to us that might not be entirely accurate. And so, in order to avoid strange teachings that might take us off the path and prevent us from continuing in our relationship with God, we need to know the Scriptures in order to know God's character, in order to do the good works that He has prepared for us to do.